Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support me on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee, all of which are in the low bar description. The links to, And don't forget to check out my Substack, especially now that I've started also, in addition to the dialogue I've been having with Raging Mandrill, you can also check out a new series I've been working on called Esoteric Geopolitics, of which the first installment was an essay I did on Russia, and this is sort of an extension of the same concept, but with the Arthurian Mythos. So let's begin. The Arthurian Mythos can be analyzed in at least, but not limited to, three ways: historically, theologically, and hermetically. I will analyze the story with these three lenses in mind. The entire mythos can be summed up succinctly as a search for God in individual wholeness, and the failure to do so in the heart of the king and his realm brings it to ruin. The Arthurian mythos represents more than just insular British narrative. The Arthurian mythos represents more than just an insular British narrative, but a narrative of Western Europe and a broader Christendom. Arthur has knights that are not just Christian and British, but also pagan, Celtic, and Germanic, and even some Saracens, like Palamedes. The key touchstone of this mythos, much like the legends of Robin Hood, is that there are meant to be added to. If there is a canonical Arthur, it is Mallory's La Morte d'Arthur, which serves as the foundation for Roger Greene's King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and T.H. White's Once and Future King. Having read Mallory's La Morte d'Arthur and White's Once and Future King, I will draw most heavily from these sources. This is in part a proof of concept for my Esoteric Geopolitics, rooted in the concept of a biospirit, supplemented by the insights of esoteric thought and history. Since the term biospirit is not very well defined, and if you've read my Russian essay, then you know I don't even know what it means in specific detail, though it has a general sense of we kind of already know what it means without it being explained. But I'm going to explain it, just for the record, so we know what I mean as we move forward. If a living organism, such as a cow, is made up of a combination of cells, and each cell is made up of a composite of molecules, take this process down to subatomic particles, and you get the concept of morphogenesis, which in biology is the concept that individual cells and tissue conglomerate into a single living organism. A biospirit, then, is the spiritual expression of a nation, its soul, if you will, that is a growing and living organism made up of a combination of factors ranging from its bioregion, the people that live there, and the intellectual and cultural strains throughout. Biospirits can die, as did the Roman Empire, or are constantly recombined and we get anew, like China. In esoteric terms, the legend of Arthur's return to save Britain in her darkest hour is an expression of an English or British biospirit principle. We can call this principle the Arthurian principle, and I will define the Arthurian principle as: when a national biospirit is under existential threat, it will form a solid front to fight this threat, like a human body fighting pathogens. Oftentimes, a charismatic leader will arise to lead this process. Sometimes, as in the case of Joan of Arc in France, even a young girl. It is this level of analysis that allows for the introduction of alchemical, occult, and perennial insights to be overlaid on geopolitics. This is all very fuzzy, theoretical, and at the cusp of something more, a variation on the theme of an epiphany. All right, history. Was Arthur a historical figure? I argue that Arthur was a historical figure, and that he was Ambrosius Aurelianus, who defeated the Saxons at the Battle of Badon, or alternatively Bath. The first mention of the historical king named Arthur is Nennius in his Historia Britannium, where he states, "Then it was that the magnanimous Arthur, with all the kings and military force of Britain, fought against the Saxons. And though they were many more noble than himself, yet he was 12 times chosen their commander, and was often a conqueror. The 12th was a most severe contest, where Arthur penetrated to the hill of Badon. In this engagement, 940 fell by his hand alone, no one but the Lord affording him assistance. In all these engagements, the Britons were successful, for no strength can avail against the will of the Almighty." This is our first hook, the Battle of Bath, or Badon, or Bath. While earlier sources such as Gildas and Bede do not mention an Arthur, they do mention the Battle of Badon and one Ambrosius Aurelianus. Gildas, in his On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, mentions Ambrosius Aurelianus as the victor at the Battle of Mount Badon. But in the meanwhile, an opportunity happening, when these most cruel robbers were returning home, the poor remnants of our nation, to whom flocked from diverse places round about our miserable countrymen as fast as bees to their hives, for fear of an ensuing storm, being strengthened by God, calling upon him with all their hearts, as the poet says, with the unnumbered vows they burdened heaven, that they might not be brought to utter destruction, took arms under the conduct of Ambrosius Aurelianus, a modest man who of all the Roman nation was then alone in the confusion of this troubled period by chance left alive. His parents, who for their merit were adorned with the purple, had been slain in these same broils, and now his progeny in these our days, although shamefully degenerated from the worthiness of their ancestors, provoked to battle their cruel conquerors, and by the goodness of our Lord obtained the victory. After this, sometimes our countrymen, sometimes the enemy won the field, to the end that our Lord might this land try after his accustomed manner these his Israelites, whether they love him or not, until the year of the siege of Bath Hill, when took place also the last, almost, though not the least, slaughter of our cruel foes, which was, I am sure, 44 years and 1 month after the landing of the Saxons, and also the time of my own nativity. Bede, in his Ecclesiastical History of England, reports that Ambrosius Aurelianus in 456 AD, let me fix that real quick, defeated the Saxons at Badon Hill. When the army of the enemy, having destroyed and dispersed the natives, had returned home to their own settlements, the Britons began by degrees to take heart and gather strength, sallying out of the lurking places where they had concealed themselves, and with one accord imploring the divine help that they might not utterly be destroyed. They had at that time for their leader Ambrosius Aurelianus, a man of worth, who alone by chance of the Roman nation had survived the storm in which his parents, who were of the royal race, had perished. Under him the Britons revived, and offering battle to the victors by the help of God, gained the victory. From that day, sometimes the natives and sometimes their enemies prevailed, till the year of the siege of Badon Hill, where they made no small slaughter of their enemies, about 44 years after their arrival in England, but of this hereafter. Just notice in the reading, it's quite likely Bede is lifting a lot of this verbatim from Gildas. It's not exactly the same, because Gildas speaks of his own nativity, but the turns of phrase are very similar. So I would say textually, it seems that Bede is using at least part of Gildas' sources. Both Gildas and Bede agree that Ambrosius was a Roman, the last of the Romans in Britain. Gildas claims he was of the purple, a patrician maybe. The fact that Nennius reports him as a Welsh king might indicate, well, one royal among other royals. And since he was chosen amongst the others, according to Nennius, it might have been more like a war band electing a chief. But then again, these chiefs would have been considered petty kings by the people that they lived with. Might indicate he was a Roman Briton. It was not uncommon for the Roman nobility in Britain to intermarry with the British nobility. If so, then Ambrosius might be royal on both sides of his lineage, Roman and British. Nennius states Arthur was of noble birth, but not of the noblest blood. This probably indicates that Nennius is speaking in terms of Arthur's British lineage rather than his Roman. Being Welsh, Nennius would be more interested in that side of his lineage than the Roman, as both Gildas and Bede Latin Christians were. We know that the Battle of Badon happened, and we know that Ambrosius fought there. Why then did Ambrosius become Arthur? In my estimation, there are two probable causes. One, Arthur was Ambrosius's British name, while Ambrosius was his Latin name. Or two, Arthur is a later corruption of the name of Ambrosius. If it is informative that Arthur takes place in the limbo between the Roman withdrawal from Britain and the rise of Christian Saxon kingdoms, this is where the historical record such a hero might be found. If we view Arthur as an expression of the British biospirit, we see that he is a fusion of continental and Latin themes with insular and British Celtic themes. The fully fleshed out story by Malory is mythic in the sense of being the true myth as Tolkien spoke of. I will argue later that I believe Malory was an esoteric adept who incorporated many esoteric and Christian themes into his story. Side note, many people are puzzled why Arthur is figured as marching on Rome and becoming a Roman emperor. If we view the Arthurian Mythos as an ever-expanding create-your-own adventure and fanfic expression of the British biospirit, then we can see that this is clearly taken from Constantine. Constantine was a governor of Britain and then marched on Rome, became emperor of the entire empire. Esoteric. The theme of God and finding God is central to the mythos. The round table is round because it represents that God is at the center of the kingdom Arthur is forging. It is a symbol that represents in a tangible form that Arthur is seeking to build a kingdom on God's foundation. The Mallory mythos is divided into two major sections before and after the Grail quest. When Arthur is at peace from his foes, he still has a lot of knights on his hands looking for honor and glory. He seeks to bring God tangibly to the realm in the form of the Holy Grail. It is his failure to do so that dooms Camelot. The Holy Grail is, of course, a Christian symbol in that it represents the legend that Joseph of Arimathea held the cup to catch the blood of Christ as he hung from the cross. The Holy Grail is also esoterically a symbol of the Philosopher's Stone and represents the healing power of the stone. This is told in the Arthurian mythos with Percival using the Grail to heal the Fisher King of his injury. The Philosopher's Stone, geometrically represented as a circle that contains a triangle, that contains a square, that contains a circle. The two circles represent God. First, man seeks God, and then when sanctified, becomes like God. This inner circle represents the union of reason and emotion, the masculine and the feminine. The healing of the Fisher King represents this formula, as his wound in his loins represents the pain a woman feels in childbirth and the man's inability to procreate. This healing of the wound is the resolution and union of the male and female. The round table can be seen as the outer circle and the achieving of the Grail, the inner circle of self-actualization. Arthur and his knights, with the exception of Sir Galahad, Sir Percival, and Sir Bors, fail the alchemical quest of uniting reason and emotion, and Camelot falls. Mallory does not have much to say, nor do later authors on Galahad and Percival after receiving the Grail, as they are seen as too righteous and pure to return to mundane life. Sir Bors does return to mundane life and joins Lancelot for the final battle. Sir Bors represents the alchemical unity of the Philosopher's Stone and the return to mundane life. Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot represent the inner triangle of the Philosopher's Stone and a broken triangle, as this is where Camelot fails. The treachery and breach of trust in the illicit union of Queen Guinevere and Lancelot is used by Mordred to bring down Arthur and Camelot. Lancelot was originally named Galahad. Foreshadowing of his son represents his emotional side in man. Lancelot does rather than thinks. This gets him into lots of trouble. The triangle having 3 points represents the Trinity, and Lancelot being driven by sexual desire represents the idolization of love and the supplanting of God by courtly love. This broken Trinity prevents Arthur from realizing his dream of the Philosopher's Stone. Galahad, who is pure and sacrifices all to God, finds and achieves the Grail, represents the completion of this alchemical ritual. Lancelot fails in the Grail quest because of his lust and sin, whereas Galahad does not. For example, in trying to see the Grail, Lancelot is sent into a stupor by a divine power for 24 days, representing the number of years he has carried on his affair with Guinevere. If we see the fall of Lancelot as a cautionary tale, what is the solution? The solution is foreshadowed in his original name, Galahad. The true Galahad places God at the center of his life, and a triangle of Arthur, Guinevere, and Galahad represents the resolution of this phase of the alchemical process. Sir Bors is a nod to future possibilities in this regard. While Sir Bors is not the only knight who survives the fall of Arthur at the Battle of Camelot, he represents the path through the trials and travails of royal intrigues. Unlike Galahad and Percival, Bors is not a virgin, but finds life and lawful wedlock with Yvain. We could then superimpose the insights of Kierkegaard and the Knight of Faith onto this triangle. One does not have to totally renounce the world to attain the Grail, and can live in this life. That Mallory does not elaborate more on Sir Bors, the Knight of Faith, is no surprise, and that Kierkegaard himself said he never saw such a man, but knew that such a man could and would exist in future, and did in the past with Abraham. The great reversal of fortune that Kierkegaard sees in the Knight of Faith, finally being united to the princess by the grace of God, is Tolkien's eucatastrophe. Arthur's triangle broke with Lancelot, and he could have chosen Galahad or Bors to complete the triangle. On one level, Camelot can be seen as Arthur building a realm of law to elevate man to the Knight of Infinite Resignation, where Kierkegaard placed himself and created an environment for several knights of faith to arise and then pass away. Camelot is a Christian existentialist work on how one can attain the ethical level of morality through the aesthetics of chivalry in order to achieve the religious level of ethics via faith. Schemes beget schemes. Merlin conspires with Uther Pendragon to seduce Igraine, wife of Gorlias, via enchantments whereby Igraine believed that Uther coming into her was her husband Gorlias. This kind of enchantment is repeated on 2 more occasions, Mordred and Galahad. Arthur, shortly after becoming king, is enchanted and seduced by his half-sister Morgause in order to conceive an heir to revenge herself on Arthur, Mordred. The sin of Arthur's birth is recapitulated in the sin of Mordred's birth. The next repetition of this theme is Galahad's conception, Elaine and Lancelot. The Fisher King, King Pelles, contracts the services of the enchantress Dame Bruzin to enchant Elaine to appear like Guinevere, for Lancelot will sleep with no other woman but Guinevere. Pelles does this in order to fulfill the prophecy that the Grail will be found by the greatest knight and heal his wound. By this deception, Elaine is with child by Lancelot and gives birth to Galahad. Galahad breaks the cycle of sexual sin by a life of renunciation. Lancelot fails because he failed to live up to his namesake Galahad. His pride at being the greatest knight and his sin with Guinevere destroyed his chances of seeing the Grail. Galahad breaks this generational cycle by renouncing the world. In many regards, Galahad is inspired by the new order of crusading knighthood as espoused by Bernard of Clairvaux. The hidden hand behind all of this, Merlin, was also conceived in sin. His mother was seduced by an incubus, and in order to prevent Merlin from becoming the Antichrist, was baptized and had this unresolved tension of supernatural evil and good coexisting within him. Merlin is sort of a dark Samuel figure who leads and guides Arthur, a David figure. We find 4 illicit conceptions, Merlin, Arthur, Mordred, and Galahad, all stemming from the work of evil spirits. Galahad breaks this cycle and leaves Camelot. Galahad is a Joseph figure, for like Joseph, he breaks a 3-fold generational sin. For Joseph, it was lying, as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all had trouble with lying. The first 2 about their relationship to their wives, and Jacob with just about everything. Jacob's lies were bound on his head when his sons lie to him that Joseph is dead. Joseph refuses to lay with and lie about Potiphar's wife, getting him thrown in jail. Yet, like a true knight of faith, God works the great reversal for Joseph by freeing him and making him second to Pharaoh. Galahad, by renouncing the world, and in particular sexual intercourse, breaks the generational sin of evil conception, beginning with Merlin. This is the square and the alchemical symbol of the lapis. This set of 4 is expressed alchemically in the phrases 1 become 2, 2 become 3, and out of the third comes the 1 as the 4th. Carl Jung, CW, Volume 12, Psychology and Alchemy. This corresponds to the inner square, which when the 4th is expressed, forms the bridge by which 1 comes to the inner circle and manifests the spirit of God in himself. And of course, at that point, that's when Galahad, Percival, and Bors actually see the Grail, and Percival and Galahad actually, attain the Grail. This theme of sexual sin is rooted in the story of King David and Bathsheba, which repeats with Amnon and Tamar and leads to the great revolt by Absalom. Mordred is an Absalom character. Future tellings of the story ought to have Mordred a dandy with long hair, which does him in. Like David, Arthur tolerates the unruliness of Lancelot because, like Joab, he is useful to him. The affairs of state trump the higher good of faith and virtue. It is this fault that brings down Camelot. Right? I mean, Arthur has no interest in seeing the affair between Guinevere and Lancelot because Lancelot's his greatest knight. Right? So he's going to look the other way. He's going to pretend it's not happening. The lesson here is that cutting corners for some greater good, as Merlin and the Fisher King did, is not the way forward. Now, you might argue the Fisher King was more successful and that Galahad did achieve the Grail and he was healed, originally by Percival. But Percival and Galahad just disappear. They don't come back into the story. So in the long run, they just transcend time and get out of the story. The foundation was shaky and the edifice fell. One must lay a solid foundation in order to build an edifice that lasts. This, of course, Arthur's failure as well. So just to reiterate a few points, because I've covered a lot here. And when it comes to Kierkegaard, he has 3 levels of ethics. There's the aesthetic stage, the ethical stage, and the religious stage. The aesthetic stage is when one views the beauty in physical things as the first step towards a moral consciousness. And that could be sort of like chivalry, like I mentioned, the sort of heraldry and courtly love and all that stuff. Then you have the ethical, which for Kierkegaard is sort of like, or a good example of that would be in Pilgrim's Progress when Christian meets Moses, the guy who represents Moses, who's just condemning him by the law. And then the religious stage is, Abraham sacrificing Isaac. or almost sacrificing Isaac, and then various saints throughout the Old and New Testaments for Kierkegaard. And so we can see these elements here in the Arthurian mythos. You could say that Lancelot was in the aesthetic stage. You could say that Arthur was in the ethical stage and Galahad was in the religious stage. And then the reason why I picked the table is that the round table is round. Of course, that represents the circle, which is God, and the alchemical expression of the Philosopher's Stone. Then there's a triangle, which represents, of course, the Trinity, but in this case, Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, so they don't get past that stage, even though that's what Arthur's trying to do. And then the square represents the 4 points. Once you achieve the triangle, you then add yourself, which creates 4 points, and that was the fourfold evil conceptions that Galahad undid by achieving the Grail, which is the inner circle. So all of these can be found in Mallory's work. Courtly love, Kierkegaard's 3 levels of ethics: aesthetic, ethical, night of infinite resignation, and religious, night of faith. The unrequited nature of courtly love is the ethical stage, or night of infinite resignation stage of life. This is because in many cases such courtly love was intrinsically adulterous and therefore unable to be consummated unless at great risk. The attainment of the Grail by Galahad, Percival, and Bors is the attainment of the religious stage, or the night of faith. One can infer that the knights that survived alongside Sir Bors at the end of Mallory's work are knights who also achieved this third and highest ethical level as well. In many regards, we see that the theme of courtly love and the double game of subtle cues and actions bring down many knights in Camelot itself. While simultaneously being the highest expression of such love, Mallory's work can be read as strongly condemning it, especially in the Grail quest. Lancelot is not able to see the Grail due to his pride and adultery. The otherworldliness of Galahad and Percival represents the transcendent rejection of the physical world in favor of the light of truth, and they are unable to return to normal life. While not really explored as much, one can see the Grail and return to mundane life, as we see in Sir Bors. This represents, as I have said, the concept of Kierkegaard's night of faith. He pursues God and still finds an earthly existence beyond which he could hope to achieve. For instance, Sir Bors survives the civil war of Mordred and Arthur and goes to the Holy Land on crusade. Mallory himself is a shadowy figure of whom little is known. I think a pretty strong case can be made that he is himself a Christian hermeticist. His story is replete with alchemical imagery. This imagery is cloaked in Christian symbolism for, I think, 2 reasons. 1, to avoid censure by the church, and 2, because such symbolism is in fact found in Scripture, and Mallory likely saw his work as supplementary to Christianity. Right. I'm not saying that Mallory was pretending to be Christian. I think he thought he was, but he also was incorporating other elements which might not have been politic to bring about. We find examples of Solomon, the Holy Land, and the Near East in the Grail quest. One thinks of the Masonic square and level and the mysteries of Solomon. The connection seems pretty clear. So he's, with the Grail quest, they go to Palestine, which is sort of like a esoteric crusade, right? They're looking for the relic, the greatest relic in Holy Land, right? And he's writing, of course, after the high watermark of the historic crusades, which in the Holy Land ended in 1291, with the Mamelukes taking the last stronghold of the Christians. So we see that he's invoking Solomon, which of course has all sorts of esoteric significance. I think that is pretty clear what he's doing there. What's also interesting too, though, is if we want to use the Solomonic angle, we've also got, you could think of the movie National Treasure, where Solomon's treasure and the Templars are seen as a literal physical treasure, whereas I think Mallory here is telling us that the treasure is symbolic and something that's in the heart and the part of a coming to a higher level of consciousness. In addition, Mallory is incorporating general European themes from Celtic to English to French and German sources. While Nennius and Monmouth first introduced Arthur as a quasi-historical figure, Chrétien de Troyes, a Frenchman, and Wolfram von Eschenbach, a German, we see the Grail quest and Percival introduced and fleshed out. Mallory accepts these additions and adds to them himself. This represents some esoteric unity of Western thought in which not only British and English sources, but continental sources merge into this story. The empire of Arthur and his conquest of Rome in Mallory's tale represents the European-wide applicability of Arthur. He is not just a British hero, but a European hero. Arthur is elevated from a quasi-historical figure to one of legend for the purposes of expressing in symbolic form the esoteric truths of alchemy. The other thing to add as well is when did Malory write The Death of Arthur? Well, Malory himself died in 1471, which is the middle of the War of the Roses, one of England's most brutal civil wars. And the Death of Arthur was published in 1485 by William Caxton. This is right at the end of the War of the Roses. So what needs to be understood here is that Thomas Hobbes wrote his Leviathan during the English Civil War and the Cromwell Protectorate. And one of the reasons why he wrote that was to indicate that we needed a strong centralized state to avoid the anarchy that had been the War of the Three Kingdoms. I think we can read La Morte d'Arthur in the same vein. It's published at the end of the War of the Roses, and that it was when there was no king in England, and they were 30 years of just constant bloodletting. So I think also, too, it's important that in all likelihood, Malory himself, as he was writing this saying, hey, look, England doesn't have a king. There's no line of succession. Because remember, right, what proves Arthur's king? He pulls the sword out of the stone. It's some sort of mystic kingship that's rooted in something above just competing princes, which was tearing England apart at the time. So it's also true that the War of the Roses were imposing conditions on England that demanded a kind of poetic response. And so also Arthur serves as not as a necessarily a literal king, but a metaphysical ideal of kingship that England should focus on to overcome its travails. So it's kind of like the medieval version of Hobbes's Leviathan. It's, Malory saying, okay, this is how we overcome the division of England, which if we view because in alchemical context, the idea of the philosopher's stone can also be seen as the Grail. So in that regard, the idea of dissolving the soul and recombining it, salviet coagula, can be seen as England's soul being dissolved and recombined. One could even argue that Malory is saying here that England's soul is sick. It needs to be dissolved and recombined, and that would be seeking the Grail. Because by attaining the Grail, you have now reconstituted your soul and become like God. And it's that missing. So rather than an all-powerful total state, which is what Hobbes is advocating for, Malory seems to be advocating for for lack of a better word, the British biospirit recomposing itself after going through alchemical transformation. So that's mostly what I got for tonight. Let's check out the chat. Somebody says Imperator Forge. Where was it? What's the Arthurian version of the Absalom Revolt? Well, that's the final battle at Camelon with Arthur and Mordred. Mordred is Absalom in this case. Let's see. Wandering Panda, do you believe the ideas in Malory's stories were intentionally allegorical, or are they organic, necessary to the telling of the story? Well, like I said, I think Malory is talking about the true myth, right? So there's this little, I don't remember. There was some Catholic Chesterton or Lewis? I think it was Chesterton YouTube channel. They had this two actors, one Lewis, one Tolkien. They had this talk about the true myth. It was a really good little 10-minute skit, and the true myth does include. It's true not in necessarily a literal historical sense, but in a moral, metaphysical sense. Though it might incorporate physical realities like England or Jerusalem or Ambrosius Aurelianus, right? Or something like that. But and furthermore, too, the alchemical aspect of Arthur goes further back, right? So in Geoffrey of Monmouth, at the beginning of the story, so this is with the conception of Merlin and the other kings of Britain, he makes reference to the red and white dragon, which is underneath one of the castles, which represents the coming storm, the coming conflict, which alchemically has to do with this soul that hasn't been dissolved and recombined. So even Mallory's referencing alchemical concepts here. So I think what all of these guys are doing, Nennius and Mallory and Monmouth, is they're using this quasi-historical figure to make an esoteric point in order to unify England and avoid the civil strife. So Monmouth writes in the early 12th century, and that would be the anarchy with Stephen and Matilda. So we see that these Arthur stories keep cropping up when there's civil strife and no king in England. So, but what's interesting here, though, is that unlike Hobbes, they don't advocate for a total state. What they advocate for is a kind of renewal, a national renewal, right? Through these sorts of esoteric principles where you're cleansed and restored. So I think that's a really interesting aspect to the Arthurian mythos. And that's why it's constantly retold and expanded. Because if we take the concept of biospirit, that nations have souls, then like an individual human soul, they also have to go through this process of dissolving and recombining. So that, I think, is the ultimate reality behind the Arthurian mythos. But they need to pick something that's at least sort of historical to start with, because it's mythic, but it's not completely fantasy, like modern day superheroes. They don't exist. No one pretends that they existed. But in this regard, it's the case that there was this guy, Ambrosius Aurelianus, who I think is the best candidate for Arthur. And like I said, historically, I think it's either a corruption of Ambrosius, or maybe Nini is just using his British name, which is possible. So, record deepness. The themes of courtly love being the downfall of knights runs deep. Tristram and Isolde comes to mind. It even got a quasi-update in the movie Legends of the Fall. Well, yeah, and what's interesting here too is there's a lot of, when we think of the Arthurian mythos and cycle, I mean, we think of like the raised to its highest level, this idea of courtly love. But here we see, though, that it ultimately brings down the kingdom. It's not the only reason, but it's one reason. And so you could see Mallory's sort of subtly critiquing this whole process. But he's also criticizing Arthur too, because who's worthy of the Grail? Who actually achieves the Grail? Very few people. Very few people. So there's a broader meta commentary that being concerned with mundane affairs and the affairs of this world distract you from the true salvation of Britain, right? And schemes and plots like Merlin. I mean, Merlin ultimately gets locked away in a cave with Nimue. So that didn't work out. He's out of the picture. And King Pelles is healed by helping through deception to get Galahad conceived, but then Galahad just gets translated out. So it's like, okay, he goes full Enoch or something, and that's gone. And it's interesting too, because Mallory kind of reminds me of Bunyan, because Bunyan was in prison and so was Mallory, because at the end of the death of Arthur, there's a bit about him being in prison and people praying for him in prison. So that's interesting. And I guess a further connection to Bunyan is when Christian goes to the Wicket Gate to have his burden taken off, he has to pass through a path that have lions on chains on either side that'll tear him apart if he strays from the path, which is illuminated by the open door. And when Galahad tries to approach the Grail, the chapel in which it's held, there's two lions guarding it, that he has enough faith to pass through the lines, but not enough faith to go into the chapel. So that's interesting too. I wonder if Bunyan was familiar with that aspect of the Grail quest, possibly. But that's all I got for tonight. I know there's a lot to chew on, everyone, but this is, again, more on my idea of esoteric geopolitics or esoteric history. So we'll see if people like this. But this is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.